In his new piece, Richard Hanania argues that most people are making two important mistakes when they're talking about Chinese power. He says China's threat to the U.S. is often exaggerated, and the extent of the power shift that is happening is underestimated.
It can seem contradictory, but I think there's a lot there. Richard Hanania joins us now to discuss why it's not. So, Richard, let's dive into this. Why most China analysis is cope? Lay out the argument.
So if you've been watching China Watchers, and not just recently, but for the last 20, 30 years, there's a story they tell, and that story didn't come out of nowhere, and it's not specific to China. There's this idea that, okay, China started experiencing rapid economic growth. The idea was one of a few things would happen. Either the people would rise up and demand democracy because they got wealthier, the country might collapse. A lot of people have written books based on that premise, or the growth would slow down and you would get instability. And there's I link in the larger report I wrote for defense priorities. I link to just article after article in the press. Look at books that I mentioned there too. Every single piece of these predictions has been wrong. China has not democratized. Obviously, it's gone, if anything, in the opposite direction. The growth has slowed a bit. It always slows when you go from being a very poor country to sort of a middle-income country, but still very strong even for a middle-income country. Certainly much larger growth than the United States, and that was in 2020 was the biggest gap between the two countries in a real long time because of differences in how we handled COVID-19. And so you have this country that's just getting stronger, and there's still this idea in Washington that the United States can do something about this, that there's a power shift that's happening, and the U.S. can confront China and sort of maintain its global leadership role, what it's had indefinitely. And there's no reason to think that by 2050, China, by some measures, will have something like twice the economy of the U.S. What the U.S. wants from China is the U.S. wants to be able to defend Taiwan, wants to be able to maintain its influence in the Indo-Pacific, in East Asia, and there's no reason to think this would happen when a country is twice your size and on the other side of the planet. The idea that you're going to have a greater say in the affairs of it and its relationship with its neighbors is just sort of a fantasy. So I think we've been deluding ourselves on many fronts. The question is, can the U.S. live with this in the long run? And I argue in the not so much in the Substack piece, but in the longer defense priorities piece that's linked to, yeah, we can. I mean, there's no border dispute or historical territorial dispute or basic ideological schism between us and China, like there was by the Soviet Union. So yes, China's getting a lot stronger, and I think we can live with it. I think we just got to be realistic.
Richard, what do you make of the Biden framing? He likes to talk about a competition, a sort of like Cold War style competition between democracy and autocrats. He puts China and Russia and others into that bucket. What do you make of that framing?
So it's interesting because Biden has said before the State of the Union said they're going to write about this point in history. People are saying democracy can't deliver, dictatorship can, and I think there's actually probably something to that. The Chinese and the American systems are different, and the world is watching, and they're going to see who's going to do better. So I think he's right that. If you care about the future of democracy, you want to have the United States do as well as possible, and the United States and its allies. Now, what a lot of people don't like about Biden is he frames it in this way when they want something that resembles the old Cold War, which the U.S. has a lot of military spending, is interfering in other countries. So when Biden gave his State of the Union, they asked Mitt Romney about it, and Mitt Romney said something like, well, he's talking about a new threat from China, and then he goes into childcare, right? So Romney doesn't want to hear that. Romney wants to hear, okay, aircraft carriers and aid to Taiwan and banging your fist about human rights. And Biden, does a little bit of that, definitely, especially on the human rights stuff, but not as much as the China hawks want. I think Biden's approach is probably more healthy than theirs.
Sure. So let me tease it out a little bit, which is that you're saying that we should live with China. I mean, I don't think anybody wants. I mean, some people do. It's a very fringe group of like changing the CCP. I think that's crazy. I mean, it's their government, it's their country. They can do what they want. I guess the question that arises, I covered a little bit of this yesterday. Whenever their domestic or foreign policy priorities start getting spoken of by our richest and most powerful people in our country, Wall Street banks, John Cena yesterday talking about Taiwan and more. Going after that isn't necessarily saying like, I want to change the CCP or like, I can't live with the CCP or whatever. It's saying like, hey, like in our country, our people should not be have compelled speech by a foreign rival power.
Sure. But a lot of the stuff I think is driven by this sort of geopolitical concern. And I think a lot of these concerns are a little bit exaggerated. So if you take John Cena, right, the idea that a actor or a corporation has to play to local sensitivities when they want access to a market is not anything new. If you offend
No, of
Islam
course
and you
not.
go across the world, if you offend, Hinduism and you go to India, imagine if a Chinese company said, we disapprove of Black Lives Matter, or, something that
Sure.
Americans,
Right.
hold sacred or has a lot of influence here. And, if you're going to list the threats to free speech to the United States, some actors and some athletes wanting access to a foreign market, I wouldn't put it near the top of the list. Yeah, it exists. I mean, we should always, be vigorous in guarding our own liberties. I wouldn't worry about the Chinese threat to the free speech to be anywhere near the top of the list of things to worry about.
To me, it's an embarrassing story about capitalism, but that's another matter. So, Richard, I mean, what do you see as the future then, and the impact on global geopolitics? What does that look like?
So I think we're going to see more Chinese assertiveness in its own region. I don't think China is going to do. I don't think it's going to lay down and do nothing. It's natural when a country goes from a third world country to the largest economy in the world. It starts, pushing people around. The U.S. did this. Every great power has done this a bit through history. I think, and what's going to happen, I think, is basically, it's hard to predict. I'll say what we can know with pretty decent certainty, and what's a little bit more speculative. I think we can know with pretty decent certainty China is going to be the great power in East Asia. It's going to get its way on more disputes, things like Huawei. You see, like, the U.S. goes and says don't use Huawei to the countries in East Asia. China wants people to use Huawei. China gets its way some places. U.S. gets its way in other places. You're going to see more and more often China's going to get its way on these things. And so the question is the U.S. response, really. And that's a little bit more speculative. There's always the potential there could be a flare up over Taiwan. They could try to push their luck and they could try to go for the reunification. Honestly, I don't think the U.S. would go to war for Taiwan, but you never know. It depends on who's in office. I think we're going to have to. Either way, I think we're going to have to make a psychological adjustment. We've always had this idea that no matter what happens, the U.S. is ultimately in control of the global system. We're in control of what ideas dominate and the way trade flows and the way governments are. And we have the option to overthrow or try to overthrow every state in the world. There's just going to be less of that. I mean, we're going to have sort of a psychological reckoning that our place in the world is not what it used to be.
Yeah, I think. So you always make me think, Richard. I feel like everything you write is an attack on me, but it's okay. That's why I enjoy having you on the show. So thank you, sir.
That's what we're all about.
Appreciate it.
Great to have you, Richard. Thank you.
Bye.
Coming up, we've got former congressional candidate Charles Booker. He's going to talk about his exploratory run for Senate against Rand Paul in Kentucky. That's next.